Think about our modern world: global corporations, interconnected economies, vast fortunes. Where did it all begin? Not in a Silicon Valley garage. You can trace it back to a single, audacious business deal, pitched for nearly a decade by a determined outsider to the most powerful investors of his time. This isn't just the story of a discovery. This is the story of the contract that launched empires and created the modern financial world. This is the story of a man who wasn't just an explorer, he was an entrepreneur. And his pitch wasn't just about finding new lands, it was about landing a government contract that promised him wealth and power beyond his wildest dreams. The story of Christopher Columbus is often told as a simple rhyme about sailing the ocean blue. But underneath that is a ruthless business venture, a high-stakes negotiation, and an economic gamble that paid off on a scale no one could have imagined. It was a deal that would fill Europe's treasuries, but also unleash catastrophic consequences that would reshape the entire globe. To really understand the world we live in today, you have to understand the terms of this deal. Because this wasn't just a voyage, it was the most consequential business arrangement in human history. So, how does a Genoese sailor even get a meeting with the most powerful monarchs in Europe? To get that, you have to understand the massive business problem they were all facing in the late 15th century. The global economy, as it was in a chokehold. The most valuable things in the world, spices, silk, and other luxury goods from the Far East, were controlled by just a few powerful players. For centuries, Europe had a serious appetite for the treasures of Asia. Spices like pepper and cloves weren't just for flavor, they were strategic resources. They preserved food, they were used as medicine, and they were a huge status symbol. The problem was getting them. The land route, the famous Silk Road, was long, dangerous, and at the mercy of the empires it crossed. The sea routes weren't much better. They were dominated by Italian states, especially Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. Then, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, that chokehold got even tighter. The Ottomans were the new gatekeepers, and they could, and did, slap heavy taxes on everything that passed through. This was a classic supply chain crisis. For kingdoms like Spain and Portugal, way out on the western edge of Europe, it was an economic disaster. They were at the end of a long, expensive supply chain, forced to pay insane prices to their rivals. Portugal, led by the visionary Prince Henry the Navigator, had already started trying to fix this. Their plan was slow and steady: sail down the coast of Africa, bit by bit, hoping to eventually go around the continent and open a direct sea route to India. It was a brilliant plan, but it was taking forever. This whole situation created a massive business opportunity. Whichever nation could bypass the Venetian and Ottoman monopolies wouldn't just get cheaper spices, they would control the entire flow of global wealth. It was a prize worth untold billions in today's money. Spain, in particular, was in a unique spot. By 1492, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had just completed the Reconquista, their centuries-long war to push the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula. This victory united Spain and created a powerful, ambitious nation. But it also left the royal treasury empty. They had a brand new kingdom but were cash poor and locked out of the world's most profitable business. They were desperate for a competitive edge, a way to leapfrog Portugal. This was the market opening. The problem was clear: the old trade routes were blocked. The opportunity was monumental: find a new route and become the richest nation on earth. All they needed was a viable plan and an entrepreneur crazy enough to try it. And right into this moment walked Christopher Columbus, with a pitch that was as simple as it was insane: forget going east, sail west. Columbus was, more than anything, a master salesman. He spent the better part of a decade trying to get venture capital for his enterprise of the Indies. His first logical stop was Portugal in 1484. King John II was the most forward-thinking monarch around when it came to exploration. He heard Columbus's pitch: you can reach the east by sailing west. But King John's court had the world's best navigators and astronomers. They ran the numbers. and they correctly figured out that Columbus had made a huge mistake in his math. He had seriously underestimated the size of the Earth. The experts concluded the voyage was impossible. The crew would starve long before they ever reached Asia. Besides, Portugal already had a plan that was working, even if it was slow. Their ships were creeping around Africa, and they saw that as the safer bet. So King John II rejected the proposal. It was a bad investment based on bad data. Simple as that. Humiliated, Columbus took his pitch to Spain. He showed up in 1486 and started the grueling process of trying to convince the Spanish court. For 6 long years, he was met with skepticism and ridicule. He was seen as a foreign crank with a wild idea. He followed the royal court around Spain, living on a small allowance they gave him just to keep him from taking the idea to their rivals in France or England. A royal commission reviewed his proposal and, just like the Portuguese, found his math to be absurd. They told Isabella and Ferdinand it was a terrible idea. The monarchs, busy with the war in Granada, kept putting him off. It looked like his startup was dead in the water. By January 1492, after yet another rejection, Columbus had finally had enough. He was packing his bags to go pitch the King of France. And this is where the story takes a sharp turn. It wasn't the monarchs who saved the deal. It was a small group of influential insiders who saw the potential. At the last possible second, a key figure stepped in, Luis de Santángel. Santángel was basically King Ferdinand's finance minister. He was a man who understood risk, reward, and the power of a good investment. As Columbus was literally walking away, Santángel went straight to Queen Isabella for one last, desperate plea. His argument was pure business. He reframed the whole thing. Forget the scientific debate for a second, he argued, and just look at the gamble. The risk was tiny. What was the cost of 3 small ships compared to the potential reward? If Columbus failed, the crown lost a trivial amount of money. But if he succeeded, the glory, and more importantly, the wealth that would pour into Spain, would be immeasurable. To lose so little for a chance to gain so much was a bet worth taking. To seal the deal, Santángel even offered to arrange the financing himself, making sure the queen wouldn't have to risk her own money. He made it clear she wouldn't need to pawn her crown jewels, a popular myth, because he could get the funds through loans and his own accounts. This intervention was the turning point. Santángel and a few others convinced the monarchs to stop looking at Columbus as a crazy scientist and start seeing him as a high-risk, high-reward venture. The pitch worked. Columbus was called back. After years of rejection, his startup was finally getting funded. But now came the hard part, negotiating the contract. And Columbus, after all that humiliation, was about to make some of the boldest demands in business history. With the monarchs on board, they started hammering out what would become one of the most important contracts ever written, the Capitulations of Santa Fe. Signed on April 17, 1492, this was no vague decree. It was a detailed business agreement. And Columbus, who now held all the cards, laid out his breathtaking demands. First, he wanted titles. He was to be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, a hereditary title that would pass down to his kids forever. This was a rank usually reserved for the highest nobility in Spain. He was basically asking to be made a permanent, high-ranking noble. Second, he demanded to be Viceroy and Governor-General over all the lands he discovered. This gave him massive political power. He would be the crown's top man, the supreme authority in these new territories. The contract even said he'd get to nominate the people for every job under him. But the wildest part was the money. Columbus demanded 10% of all revenues from the new lands. The deal also gave Columbus the option to invest his own money, 1/8 of the cost, in any future trading expeditions. In return, he'd get an additional 1/8 of the profits from those trips. This clause turned him from a contractor into a full-blown equity partner in the whole enterprise. So why on earth would the famously clever Ferdinand and Isabella agree to this? Some historians think they were just that confident after their recent military victories. Others suggest a more cynical reason. They simply didn't think he was ever coming back. They were granting him 10% of nothing. The titles were worthless if he sailed off into the ocean and disappeared. It was a low-risk gamble for them, too. The funding itself was a kind of public-private partnership. The total cost was about 2 million maravedis. Forget the myth about Isabella pawning her jewels. The crown put up some money, mostly through loans. No venture capitalist in history has ever seen a return on investment like the one that came from Columbus's deal. The initial cost was tiny, but the flood of wealth, resources, and power from the Americas to Europe was so huge it permanently rewired the global economy. We now call this world-altering ROI the Columbian Exchange. First, there was the literal treasure. The discovery of massive silver mines in places like Potosí, Bolivia, and Zacatecas, Mexico, flooded Europe with unimaginable amounts of precious metal. This was the lifeblood of the Spanish Empire, funding its powerful armies and endless wars. But this fire hose of new money had another effect. It triggered massive, runaway inflation across the continent in what's known as the price revolution. For about 100 years, prices in Western Europe skyrocketed, in some cases rising 6 times over. This inflation completely changed European society. Wages couldn't keep up with prices, crushing the purchasing power of the average person. It penalized the old money aristocrats and rewarded ambitious entrepreneurs, forcing the development of more modern finance. This period helped pave the way for the shift from feudalism to capitalism. Beyond just silver and gold, the exchange of plants and animals created even more lasting wealth. New world crops transformed Europe. The potato, though it took a couple of centuries to really catch on, eventually helped end the cycle of famine in northern Europe and fueled a massive population boom. Corn had a similar effect. Tomatoes would go on to redefine Italian food. This agricultural revolution provided the food and the population growth that would later power the Industrial Revolution. At the same time, Old World cash crops like sugar and coffee were brought to the Americas and grown on a massive scale, cultivated by enslaved Africans, becoming phenomenally profitable commodities for Europe. This two-way exchange created vast new global trade networks. The triangular trade connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a brutal but highly profitable system, enriching port cities like Seville, Lisbon, and later London. The deal signed in Santa Fe hadn't just opened a new route, it had created a new global economy centered on the Atlantic, with Europe holding all the power. Of course, this incredible return for Europe was built on an equally incredible cost for the people of the Americas and Africa. The collapse from disease was followed by centuries of exploitation, forced labor, and the violent destruction of entire civilizations. The return on investment for that business deal was, for millions, a story of dispossession and death. The contract Columbus signed was more than just a license for a voyage. It was the founding document of a new economic age. It created the model for state-sponsored, high-risk ventures, a model every European power would rush to copy on their own path to empire. If you're fascinated by the business deals that shaped our world, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel, History Wealth Playbook, for more of empire-building secrets to uncover. The story of Christopher Columbus isn't a simple tale of discovery. It's a business story. It's the story of a relentless entrepreneur who spent years on the road pitching a high-risk venture to skeptical investors. It's the story of a last-minute save by a smart finance minister who understood asymmetric bets. And it's the story of an unbelievable contract, the Capitulations of Santa Fe, which laid out some of the best terms an entrepreneur has ever gotten. Columbus didn't just sail the ocean blue. He negotiated a deal that made him a partner in creating an empire. The venture he launched pivoted from finding a new route to building a new world under European control. The return on that initial investment, the silver that remade Europe's economy, the crops that fed its people, and the trade networks that built global capitalism, was bigger than anyone could have predicted. The deal's legacy is two-sided. It built the foundations of our modern economy while unleashing centuries of devastation. But that raises a whole new question. If the deal was so good, how did Columbus's personal empire fall apart so fast? And what does that teach us about the difference between making a fortune and keeping one? That's a story for the next episode. Thanks for watching.